The first thing Lydia Voss ever said to me was that I owed her association $7,400 for using my own lake, and the second thing she said was worse. She told me if I did not pay by Friday, Pine Ridge Shores would begin the process of taking control of Red Bank Lake. Now, I had just buried my uncle 3 weeks earlier. I had spent 23 years designing water systems for factories outside St. Louis, and I had driven 4 hours into the Missouri Ozarks because I thought I was coming home to a little quiet. So I stood there looking at this woman in a cranberry-colored suit, holding a leather folder against her chest like it contained the 10 Commandments. And I honestly thought she had taken a wrong turn somewhere on the road. It was November of 1998, cold enough for your breath to hang over the water in the morning, and Red Bank Lake looked exactly the way it had when I was a boy, dark blue under the pines, with cedar docks leaning into the shallows and old fishing boats tied off behind cabins that had seen better decades. My Uncle Earl used to say the lake had a personality. He said some mornings it looked peaceful enough to forgive you for your mistakes, and some mornings it looked like it knew every bad thing you ever did. That day, standing beside my truck with Lydia Voss smiling at me like a banker smiling at a man who missed a payment, Red Bank Lake looked like it was trying very hard not to laugh. My name is Daniel Mercer, though most people on Willow Bend called me Dan, and at 48 years old I had finally reached that part of life where silence meant more to me than ambition. I had done the city thing, the overtime thing, the corporate meetings where men in grey suits argued over pipe diameters like they were discussing the fate of the Republic, and after my divorce I had worked harder than I needed to because work was easier than going home to an empty apartment. Then Uncle Earl passed away at 79, leaving me his cabin, his old pickup, a shed full of tools I did not know how to use, and Red Bank Lake, all 2,600 acres of it, along with the creek bed, the spring valves, and a collection of paper maps so old they smelled like dust and tobacco. I knew the lake was valuable, but I never thought of it that way. To me, it was where Uncle Earl taught me to fish with a cane pole, where my mother used to bring a thermos of coffee on Sunday mornings, where I learned that a person could sit still for an hour and not be wasting time. Lydia did not care about any of that. She stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car that looked far too polished for a gravel road, glanced at my old Ford pickup like it had insulted her personally, then placed the folder on my windshield. She said, "Mr. Mercer, you are in violation of Pine Ridge Shores Association policies regarding lake access, shoreline maintenance, unregistered dock use, and environmental stabilization contributions." I looked at the papers, then at her. I said, "Lady, this lake belonged to my family before your association was a thought in anybody's head." She gave me a small smile, the kind people use when they think you are about to embarrass yourself. She said, "Your family may hold old land records, Mr. Mercer, but Pine Ridge Shores manages this body of water for the benefit of the community." I remember looking past her, toward the lake, toward the old boathouse Uncle Earl built with his own hands in 1959, and thinking maybe I had misunderstood the whole sentence. I said, "You manage it." She nodded. I said, "Then I suppose you will be repairing the dock next spring." Her smile faded just enough for me to know I had hit something. She told me I was being flippant. I told her she was standing on my property in high heels, threatening to charge me for looking at my own water. So yes, I was probably being a little flippant. That was when she leaned closer and lowered her voice. She said, "Mr. Mercer, I suggest you do not make this difficult. Your uncle was behind on these obligations for many years, and he understood the consequences of refusing to cooperate." That caught me. Uncle Earl had never mentioned an HOA, never once said he owed anybody a dime. And he was not the type of man who quietly accepted a bill he did not believe in. He once drove 30 miles to return a $10 overcharge at a feed store because he said the cashier was too young to know better and the owner was too old to care. So when Lydia said he understood the consequences, I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked her what consequences she meant. She tapped the folder with one manicured finger. She said, "Daily penalties, legal collection, and if necessary, a petition for custodial lake control." Custodial lake control. Custodial lake control. It sounded like a phrase invented by a man who had never owned a fishing rod. I said, "You are telling me your little neighborhood committee can take a lake away from the man who owns it?" She looked at me over the top of her sunglasses and said, "I am telling you that people who refuse to cooperate often discover they do not have as much control as they think. Then she turned, walked back to her Lincoln, and drove away slow enough for me to see the dust settle behind her tires. I stood there for a while with the folder in my hand, listening to the water knock against the dock, and I wish I could say I felt angry right away. But the truth is, I felt confused first. There is a kind of confidence that comes from knowing you are right, and there is another kind that comes from believing nobody has the energy to prove you wrong. Lydia Voss had the second kind. That night, I sat at Uncle Earl's kitchen table with a pot of coffee, the folder spread out beside a faded red plaid tablecloth he'd owned since I was a kid, and I read every page. They had billed him for lake access, boat access, shoreline management, water quality assessments, drainage supervision, and something called a seasonal aquatic support fee, which I read 3 times because I could not decide whether it sounded more like a tax or a scam. The charges went back nearly 12 years. There were late fees on top of late fees, administrative penalties, hearing costs, filing costs, and the final notice that said Pine Ridge Shores had the authority to protect the community from unauthorized private control of shared water resources. I nearly laughed at that, but then I found the first thing that stopped me. There were copies of notices sent to Uncle Earl, all in the same crisp letterhead, all with the same signature at the bottom. Lydia Voss, President, Pine Ridge Shores Association. Some were unopened. Some had been marked with Earl's handwriting in blue ink. One said, "Return to sender, not my lake." Another said, "Try again when hell freezes." The oldest one was dated 1987. That meant Lydia had been after him for more than 10 years. I called Sheriff Tom Raines the next morning because I had known him since we were teenagers, though back then he had a mullet, a dirt bike, and an unfortunate belief that he could sing country music. By 1998, he had traded the mullet for a sheriff's badge and the dirt bike for a county cruiser, but he still had the same slow way of speaking, like every word needed to walk down a long dirt road before it reached you. I put the folder on his desk, and he read through it without saying much. Finally, he leaned back, rubbed his jaw, and said, "Dan, I have seen those notices before." I said, "From Uncle Earl." He shook his head. "From half the people living around that lake." He told me Pine Ridge Shores had started as a small neighborhood association in the late 80s, mostly folks with vacation cabins and retirement homes, and in the beginning they did ordinary things, repaired roads, collected trash, complained about loud boats on holidays, the usual mess. Then Lydia Voss became president. She had moved in from Kansas City after her husband died. She was smart, organized, polished, and according to Sheriff Raines, she had a gift for making a demand sound like a favor. One year, it was dock permits. The next year, boat decals, then shoreline inspections, then lake protection assessments. And pretty soon, people were paying fees they did not understand because they thought everybody else must know something they did not. I asked Tom why nobody fought her. He looked out the window for a moment and said, "Because most folks around here are retired, or stretched thin, or tired of arguing. She picks people who do not have the money to hire lawyers, and she makes every problem look like their fault." Then he reached into a drawer, pulled out a thin file, and slid it toward me. Inside were reports from the previous year, complaints about lawn runoff, illegal septic systems, unpermitted docks, barking dogs, even one complaint accusing an old widower named Harold Baines of dumping motor oil into the lake. Every complaint had been anonymous. Every person accused had one thing in common. They had questioned an HOA bill. I asked Tom if he thought Lydia was behind it. He sighed and said, "I think she is careful. Careful people are hard to prove." I left the sheriff's office with the folder under my arm and a bad feeling I could not shake. Back at the cabin, I climbed into the attic where Uncle Earl kept everything he did not want to throw away, which was apparently most of the 20th century. There were boxes of fishing magazines, coffee cans full of bolts, old calendars, receipts from hardware stores that had been closed for 15 years, and enough newspapers to insulate a small town. I spent 3 hours sneezing through dust until I found a dented metal cash box tucked behind an old army blanket. Inside were copies of every HOA notice, a bundle of letters tied with twine and a faded envelope with my name on it. "Daniel," it said in Uncle Earl's handwriting, "if you are reading this, they finally came after you. Do not argue with them before you find the blue ledger. The lake is not the thing they want. The water is." I read that sentence 6 times. The lake is not the thing they want. The water is. I'd spent my career working with water pressure, treatment systems, flood controls, industrial runoff, and municipal pipes, so I knew better than most people that water was never just water. It was farmland, money, construction, tourism, development, power. I went back through every box until I found a thin blue ledger tucked inside an old tackle box beneath a pile of cracked bobbers. It was smaller than I expected, a simple cloth-covered book with water stains around the edges. Inside was survey maps from 1912, handwritten notes from my great-grandfather, a county filing from 1946, and an original water reservation agreement that gave the Mercer family control over Red Bank Lake, its feeder springs, its outlet valves, and a broad strip of shoreline running almost the entire east and north sides. The document had been renewed several times through the years, most recently in 1984, and written in plain language was one sentence that changed everything. Red Bank Lake shall remain excluded from future subdivision authority, association governance, or private development control unless voluntarily transferred by the Mercer estate. I sat there on the attic floor with that paper in my hand and felt something shift inside me. Uncle Earl had not ignored Lydia because he was stubborn. He had ignored her because he knew exactly what she was trying to do. He had been standing alone against her for years, and now that he was gone, she thought I would be easier to move. I called the one attorney in Willow Bend who handled property disputes, a woman named Helen Price. Helen was 50-something, sharp as a razor, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had a way of making you feel like you had already lost an argument before she opened her mouth. Her office was above a pharmacy downtown, next to a tax preparation business and a barber shop that still had a striped pole out front. I laid the blue ledger on her desk, and she did not say a word for a full 5 minutes. She read every page slowly, then removed her glasses, looked at me and said, "Dan, where did you get this?" I said, "My uncle left it in a tackle box." She nodded once and said, "That sounds about right." Then she pointed at the old water reservation agreement and told me Pine Ridge Shores had no legal right to regulate the lake, charge fees for lake access, issue permits for docks on Mercer land, or claim environmental authority over water it did not own. I asked her if that meant Lydia was bluffing. Helen looked at the stack of notices and said, "No, it means she has been lying. There is a difference." Then she showed me something I had missed. On the bottom of several HOA notices, there was a reference to a county environmental review board. Helen called a clerk at the county courthouse, waited while a fax machine screamed somewhere in the hall, then read the answer that came back. The board did not exist. Not under that name, not in that county, not anywhere in Missouri. The signature on the notices belonged to a Dr. Wallace Danner, environmental consultant. Helen called the state licensing office. No Dr. Wallace Danner had ever held an environmental license in Missouri. I felt my stomach turn. I said, "So she has been making this up?" Helen leaned forward and said, "Dan, she has been making up enough of it to scare people into paying. That is different. That is bigger. And it is not just an HOA fight anymore. I wish I could tell you that once we had the documents, everything got easier, but that is not how people like Lydia operate." The next morning, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee, 3 county vehicles came rolling up my gravel drive. One had a building department logo on the door, one belonged to septic inspection, and one was from the county environmental office. They parked like a small invasion force. A tired-looking man named Carl stepped out of the first truck with a clipboard in his hand and said, "Mr. Mercer, we received complaints about shoreline erosion, an unsafe dock, and possible septic leakage into Red Bank Lake." I looked at the 3 trucks, then at the lake, then back at Carl. I said, "You folks coordinate your ambushes now, or is this a special holiday package?" Carl gave me a look that told me he had spent his whole morning regretting his career choice. He said, "We are required to investigate complaints." I said, "I understand, but I would appreciate it if you would write down that none of you arrived here because of anything you saw with your own eyes." They spent the next 2 hours measuring the dock, walking the shore, testing the septic field, examining drainage rock, and making notes. I followed them with an old Sony camcorder Uncle Earl had bought at a garage sale, not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because after 2 decades of engineering work, I had learned one important thing. People become more honest when they know there is a camera pointed at them. The dock passed, the shoreline passed, the septic system passed. The environmental officer, a young woman named Trish, crouched beside the reinforced bank near the water and said quietly to Carl, "This is better than half the county jobs I inspect." I said, "Could you repeat that for the camera?" She looked at me, then at the camcorder, and to her credit she did. By the time the inspectors left, Sheriff Rains had arrived. He pulled me aside and told me all 3 anonymous complaints came from the same phone number, a number registered to an old address Lydia Voss had used before she moved to Pine Ridge Shores. I asked him if that was enough to arrest her. Tom shook his head. He said, "Not yet, but it is enough to make her nervous if she finds out I know." I told him I was past worrying about making Lydia nervous. That afternoon, Helen came to the cabin with a legal pad, a portable fax folder, and the expression of somebody who had found a loose thread in an expensive sweater. She said, "We know she has been taking money. We know she has been faking authority. And we know she has been using county offices to harass people. What we do not know is why she needs this lake badly enough to risk all of it." I looked toward the water and remembered Uncle Earl's note. The water is what they want. I told Helen I wanted to inspect the old flow valve on the north side of the lake. She asked why. I said, because that valve controls the spring feed, and if somebody is stealing water, it will tell me. She stared at me for a second, then said, "You really did become your uncle." I said, "I hope not all at once." The north side of Red Bank Lake was rough country, thick pine woods, limestone shelves, and old dirt paths that had not been maintained since my grandfather was alive. Uncle Earl took me there once when I was 13. He had pointed at an iron wheel half buried under leaves and said, "This is the heart of the lake. If you ever own this place, learn how it breathes." I remembered thinking that was the kind of thing old men said when they wanted to sound mysterious. At 48, I finally understood what he meant. I carried a tool bag, a handheld pressure gauge, a paper map, and an old field notebook. There was no satellite app in my pocket, no digital map glowing on a screen, just a compass, a flashlight, and the kind of practical equipment that worked whether you had cell service or not. When I found the valve, the first thing I noticed was that it had been recently cleared of brush. Somebody had been there. The old Mercer stamp was still visible on the metal. Mercer Flowgate, number 1, 1912. I tested the pressure at the intake line, and the numbers did not make sense. Water was leaving the lake faster than it should have been. At first I thought maybe there had been a break in the old system, but the pressure drop was too steady, too controlled. Then I walked the shoreline south and found a place where the ground had been disturbed beneath a patch of dead grass. It looked like nothing until you stood close. A strip of fresh gravel, a shallow trench line, a rusted service cap hidden under branches. I had spent enough years around pumps and industrial lines to know what I was looking at. Somebody had buried a pipe, a big one. I followed the line as far as I could before it disappeared into the woods and heard a voice behind me. "You must be Earl's nephew." I turned and saw a woman sitting on a folding chair near the bank, fishing pole in one hand, cigarette in the other. Her name was Elsie Boone, though everybody called her Miss Elsie, and she had lived near Red Bank Lake since 1964. She had white hair pulled into a bun, a weathered face, and eyes that missed nothing. I said, "I am Dan Mercer." She nodded and said, "I am Dan Mercer." She nodded and said, "I am Dan Mercer." She nodded and said, "I figured. You walk like Earl when you are mad." I told her I was not mad yet. She gave a little snort and said, "Honey, that is because you have not found enough yet." She had known Uncle Earl for years, she said, and she remembered a developer visiting the lake in 1993, a man named Victor Hale. Victor had built a marina 2 counties over, then a small resort near Branson, and he had been looking for land around Red Bank Lake because the water was cleaner and the shoreline was cheaper. Uncle Earl had thrown him off the property after a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. I asked Miss Elsie if she knew what Victor wanted. She flicked ash into the dirt and said he wanted the lake to serve his new resort project. Earl told him the lake was not for sale. Then she looked toward the woods where the hidden pike ran and said, "Looks like somebody found another way to buy it." When I came back to the cabin, Helen was waiting in the driveway. I showed her my notes, the pressure readings, the location of the pipe, and the photos I had taken with my old Canon. She studied them in silence, then said, "Victor Hale owns the land west of the ridge." I said, "What is west of the ridge?" She said, "A lodge project called Eagle Crest." half-finished cabins, a new conference building, and a private golf course he has been trying to expand for 3 years. I said, "A resort needs a lot of water." Helen nodded. More water than he had rights to use. That was when the whole thing began to take shape. Lydia did not want Red Bank Lake because she liked neighborhood control. She wanted it because she had promised Victor access to the water. The HOA was not just collecting fees. It was building a story around the lake, pretending it had environmental authority, pretending it had community rights, making residents believe the lake was shared property, so that when Victor needed more water, she could call it a management decision instead of theft. That was the first time I felt real anger, not the kind that makes you yell, but the kind that makes everything become clear. Uncle Earl had spent years watching people pay Lydia for a lie, and now they were using the same lie to drain the lake he had protected his whole life. Helen filed a formal demand for Pine Ridge Shore's financial records that afternoon. In 1998, that meant certified letters, fax confirmations, hard copies, signatures and phone calls. Nobody could pretend they did not receive. We demanded vendor contracts, water maintenance expenses, environmental reports, board meeting minutes, and all communications related to Red Bank Lake. Lydia had 72 hours to respond. She did not take it well. 2 days later, she came back to my cabin with Victor Hale beside her. He was tall, silver-haired, expensive suit, perfect shoes for a man standing on gravel, and he carried himself like the world had always made room for him. Lydia did not bother pretending to be friendly this time. She said, Mr. Royal, Mercer, you are creating unnecessary trouble for the people who live here." I said, "Funny, I was about to say the same thing about you." Victor stepped forward and said, "Dan, I think there has been a misunderstanding." I said, "I did not think there has been one of those since you put a pipe under my woods." He looked at me for a long second, then said, "You should be careful making accusations without proof." I smiled, though I did not feel like smiling. I said, "You should be careful putting pipes in the ground where engineers can find them." Lydia told me I had no idea what I was risking. I told her I had spent half my life dealing with pressure systems, and the one thing I knew was that if you keep forcing pressure into a closed space, eventually something breaks. She said, "We can still resolve this privately." I said, "That is what people say when they do not want witnesses." Victor's eyes narrowed. For the first time, he looked less like a businessman and more like a man who had realized the waitress was not going to bring in the table he wanted. Then he told me I was in over my head. I looked at the lake behind them and said, "Maybe, but you are standing in over your head too." That night, Sheriff Raines called me at home. He said one of the HOA board members had come to him privately. A man named Richard Phelps, retired accountant, quiet fellow, the kind who wore suspenders, even in summer. Richard had saved copies of the association books because he did not trust Lydia. He had been too afraid to speak up while Earl was alive, then too ashamed to speak up after Earl died. But when he heard about the pipe and the false reports, he decided he could not stay quiet anymore. He left a cardboard box outside Helen's office before sunrise. Inside were ledgers, cancelled checks, vendor invoices, bank statements, and a stack of carbon copies from board meetings Lydia never wanted anyone to see. Helen and I spent the next day in her office going through them page by page. There were payments to companies with names like Blue Valley Aquatic Services, Red Bank Environmental Review, North Shore Compliance Group, and Missouri Water Stabilization Partners. None of them had addresses that made sense. One used a post office box in Arkansas, another had no tax number. A third listed a phone number that rang at a laundromat in Springfield. Helen checked state records, then smiled the way a surgeon smiles when the X-ray finally explains the pain. The companies did not exist. The checks had been deposited into accounts connected to Lydia Voss Consulting. From there, money went to Hale Development and Eagle Crest Holdings. Residents had been paying lake maintenance fees, environmental fees, drought fees, dock fees, all of it, and Lydia had been washing the money through fake vendors before sending it to Victor's development company. But there was more. In the bottom of the box, under a file labeled Road Repairs, we found copies of internal board memos. One was dated April 1996. It described a plan called the Red Bank Resource Transition. The language was dry and bureaucratic, but the meaning was plain. Pine Ridge Shores intended to establish administrative control over the lake by building a record of supposed environmental risk, forcing Mercer ownership into legal dispute, then transferring operational control to a private management company. The private management company was Eagle Crest Utilities, Victor's company. I read that memo until the words blurred. Then I found another document signed by Lydia and Victor, drafted 2 months before Uncle Earl died. It said that upon transfer or incapacity of the Mercer estate, Pine Ridge Shores would pursue emergency stewardship authority over Red Bank Lake. They knew Earl was sick. They knew Arl was the beneficiary. They had been waiting for him to die. Part 2. The fight back. Once you understand that someone has been planning around your silence, you stop wondering whether you should speak. The next thing that happened came so fast it felt like the whole county had been waiting for Lydia to show her hand. Helen sent copies of the records to the State Water Division, the county prosecutor, and every member of the Pine Ridge Shores Board. Sheriff Raines got a warrant to inspect the suspected pipe location, and I led him and 2 county engineers through the woods to the service cap I had found. We opened it just after dawn. Beneath the metal cover was a reinforced line wide enough to carry more water than any group of cabins could use. The pipe ran underground toward Eagle Crest. The county engineers tested the flow and confirmed it was active. That was the moment it stopped being a theory. There was water moving out of Red Bank Lake through an unauthorized pipeline, and every pressure reading I had taken matched the draw patterns from the previous 6 months. The system pulled hardest on holiday weekends, during fishing tournaments, and whenever Eagle Crest had events. While Lydia had been warning residents about drought conditions and charging them emergency conservation fees, Victor's resort was filling swimming pools, watering greens, supplying guest cabins, and expanding construction. Sheriff Raines stood there looking down into the open hatch and said, "Well, I guess we found out where the lake has been going." I said, "Not all of it." He looked at me. I said, "The rest went into their pockets." News traveled fast after that, faster than Lydia expected. In a place like Willow Bend, you could hide a secret from the county clerk, the bank, and maybe your own spouse, but you could not hide it from people who met every morning at the diner for coffee. By noon, everybody knew the sheriff had opened the pipe in the woods. By dinner, people were calling each other about strange fees, dry wells, and notices they had paid without ever reading. By the next morning, Lydia had called an emergency association meeting at the Pine Ridge Community Hall. The subject line on the flyer said, "Emergency Environmental Action Regarding Red Bank Lake." Underneath, in smaller letters, it said, "Proposal for Temporary Custodial Control." She was going to try to take the lake before the evidence buried her. Helen wanted to stop the meeting with an injunction, but I told her no. I said, "Let her hold it." Helen looked at me like I had suggested we solve the problem by setting fire to the courthouse. I said, "She has been hiding behind closed doors for 10 years. If she wants to lie, let her lie in front of everybody." The community hall was full by 7 that evening. There were folding chairs, coffee in styrofoam cups, a projector humming in the corner, and a local television crew from Channel 8 setting up a camera near the back wall. Lydia stood at the front in another perfect suit, this one navy blue with large charts beside her showing falling water levels, cracked shoreline photos, and red arrows pointing at my cabin. Victor sat at a table behind her, hands folded, face calm, like he had already rehearsed being innocent. Sheriff Raines stood near the side wall with 2 deputies. Helen sat beside me with a briefcase full of documents. I had the blue ledger in my hands. When Lydia started talking, she sounded polished at first. She said the community faced an immediate threat from unregulated private control of Red Bank Lake. She said the lake's shoreline had been neglected. She said hazardous drainage conditions could affect homes, docks, property values, and public safety. She said Pine Ridge Shores had reluctantly stepped in to protect residents. Then she looked directly at me and said, "Mr. Mercer has refused reasonable oversight at every stage." I stood up before I had planned to. The room got quiet because everyone knew I had never been much of a public speaker, and in a small town, people can smell when something real is about to happen. Lydia said, "Mr. Mercer, you will have a chance to speak after the board presentation." I said, "No, I think I will speak while your lies are still warm." A few people laughed and Lydia's face tightened. She said, "This is not a joke." I said, "You are right. It stopped being funny when you started charging widows for water you did not own." Then I walked to the front of the room with the blue ledger under my arm. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I had spent too many years sitting quietly in meetings where louder people filled the air with nonsense. This was different. This was Uncle Earl's Lake, my family name, and every decent person around that water who had been made to feel small because they did not have the energy to fight a woman with a clipboard. I placed the 1912 water agreement on the table in front of Lydia. I said, "This is the Mercer Water Reservation. It was filed before Pine Ridge Shores existed, before Eagle Crest existed, before you ever bought a house here. It gives my family authority over Red Bank Lake, the feeder springs, the outlet lines, and the shoreline. It also says, in plain English, that no private association can take control of this lake without the Mercer family's written consent." Lydia looked down at the document and said, "Old documents do not override modern environmental concerns." Helen stood beside me and said, "State environmental agencies handle environmental concerns. Homeowner associations do not get to invent them." Then she placed a folder beside the ledger. Inside were the fake reports, the non-existent board names, the fabricated consultant signature, the anonymous complaint records tied to Lydia's old phone number, and the financial statements from Richard Phelps. The crowd began whispering. Victor leaned forward, his expression finally changing. Helen lifted one invoice and said, "Blue Valley Aquatic Services paid $12,000. There is no such company." Red Bank Environmental Review paid $9,000. No such company. Missouri Water Stabilization Partners paid $16,000. No such company. Then she held up the bank records. The money went to Lydia Voss Consulting, then to Hale Development. The room got louder. A man in the third row stood up and shouted, "My wife and I paid $300 last summer for a drought surcharge." A woman near the window said, "They fined us because our grandson tied a canoe to our dock." Somebody else yelled, "You said the lake was drying up." Lydia raised both hands and tried to calm everyone down. She said, "These transactions are being taken out of context." I said, "Then give us the context." I said, "Then give us the context. Tell these people why their money paid for a pipeline to Eagle Crest." The room went dead quiet. Victor stood up then. He said, "That pipeline was part of an emergency water support system." I looked at him and said, "Emergency for who? Your golf course, your conference center, your private cabins." Helen put the county engineering report on the table. The pipeline had been denied 3 times under normal permits. It was later approved under a false emergency filing using a forged environmental authorization. Lydia's signature was on it. Victor's company had built it. The residents had funded it. Lydia tried one last time. She said, "This is an attack by a man who inherited property and does not understand the needs of the people who live around it." I turned to the room and said, "My family has owned that lake for 86 years, but I have never believed the water belonged to me alone. I believe it belongs to the people who respect it, fish in it, teach their kids to swim in it, and do not try to steal it from their neighbors. The problem is not that this community cared about the lake. The problem is that Lydia used that care like a weapon." That was when the television camera moved closer. I could hear the little motor inside it whirring. Lydia looked at the camera, then at the crowd, then at Victor. For the first time, she looked scared. Not angry, not offended, not composed. Scared. Victor leaned toward her and whispered something, but the room was too quiet, and enough people heard him say, "Stop talking." That was the moment she lost the room. Not because of a speech, not because of a court order, but because everybody saw the same thing at once. They saw that these two people were not protecting the community. They were protecting each other. Sheriff Raines stepped forward and said, "This meeting is over. The State Water Division has been notified, the county is securing the pipeline site, and all association records are to be preserved pending investigation." Lydia tried to walk out, but a resident named Harold Baines stood near the doorway. Harold was the widower who had been accused of dumping motor oil into the lake. He was 72, quiet as a church mouse most days, and he held up the old violation notice Lydia had sent him. He said, "You made me think I was poisoning this lake." Then he tore the notice in half and dropped it on the floor. Nobody cheered at first. They just watched Lydia walk past them, and there was something stronger than cheering in that silence. It was the silence of people who had finally stopped being afraid. The next morning, the state issued an emergency order shutting down the pipeline. County workers came with equipment, Sheriff Raines brought deputies, and I stood at the edge of the woods while they closed the valve. When the pump shut off, I could feel the change through the metal line beneath my boots. That might sound strange, but anyone who has worked around water systems knows what I mean. A machine has a rhythm, a vibration, a pressure you can sense in your bones. For 2 years, maybe longer, that pump had been quietly taking from the lake. Then it stopped. The woods got quiet. The water level did not rise all at once, of course. Life rarely gives you a dramatic miracle on schedule. But the lake seemed to settle. The wind touched the surface, and for the first time in months, I did not feel like I was looking at something under attack. Part 3. The end. The next few weeks were a blur of investigators, bankers, reporters, lawyers, state officials, and people carrying cardboard boxes out of the Pine Ridge Shores office. Lydia's accounts were frozen. The association's records were seized. Victor Hale disappeared for a few days, then surfaced through an attorney who insisted he had been misled by Lydia. That did not hold up very well once the investigators found invoices, signed contracts, construction memos, and payment records connecting him directly to the pipeline. There were even notes from one of his project managers complaining that the lake draw was not strong enough during busy weekends. Imagine writing something like that down, I thought. Imagine stealing water from an entire community and being annoyed that it was not moving fast enough. Helen found the final piece of the story in a packet of documents Richard Phelps had kept at home. It was an agreement between Lydia and Victor, dated the year before Uncle Earl died. Victor had promised Lydia a share of future resort profits if she could secure control of Red Bank Lake. Lydia had promised to create enough environmental concern that the association could claim emergency stewardship. They planned to paint Uncle Earl as an irresponsible owner, then push him into court, then take over the water system through a company Victor controlled. But Uncle Earl knew. That was why he kept the blue ledger hidden. That was why he never paid a fee. That was why he wrote me that note. He had not been fighting because he wanted to keep people away from the lake. He had been fighting because he knew what would happen if the wrong people ever controlled it. The legal process took time, as those things always do. Nobody gets a neat ending in 3 days, not in real life. But by the spring of 1999, Pine Ridge Shores was under state supervision. Lydia had been charged with financial fraud, forged filings, harassment through false reports, and conspiracy related to the water diversion. Victor faced charges tied to the unauthorized pipeline, false permit applications, and misuse of association funds. I went to the courthouse for one hearing and sat in the back row, not because I wanted to watch Lydia suffer, but because I wanted to see the moment when all the paperwork she had used to scare people finally became paperwork that answered to the truth. She looked smaller without the clipboard. That was the thing I remember most. Not weak exactly, but smaller. She had built her authority out of letters, rules, warnings, fees, and the fear that nobody would challenge her. Once the fear was gone, there was not much left. Victor looked angry the whole time. Men like Victor always think anger is a form of power. I think it is often just disappointment wearing a suit. The bigger question was what happened to Red Bank Lake after all of it. A lot of people expected me to close access, put up gates, charge everybody back for what they had done, make the lake private, and let the community deal with the consequences. I understood why they thought that. I had every legal right to do it. Some days, after another letter from a lawyer or another reporter asking for a statement, I wanted to. But then I would walk down to the dock in the evening and see Miss Elsie fishing near the reeds, or Harold Baines sitting with his grandson, or families carrying coolers and folding chairs toward the shoreline. And I would remember something Uncle Earl told me when I was a kid. He said, "Son, owning something and being responsible for it are not the same thing." I did not understand that then either. I understood it by 1999. So Helen helped me set up the Red Bank Lake Stewardship Trust. It was not fancy. We did not have a grand opening with balloons or television cameras. We had a meeting in the old community hall, the same place Lydia had tried to take the lake, and we created a board with residents, anglers, small business owners, a teacher from the local school, Miss Elsie, Sheriff Raines as a non-voting advisor, and Helen to keep us from doing anything foolish. We wrote simple rules. No secret fees, no made-up committees, no hidden contracts. Every dollar collected would be public. Every environmental decision would involve qualified state experts, not somebody's cousin with a typewriter and a fake title. We set fair fishing permits for visitors, created a shoreline repair fund, and installed real water monitoring equipment so everybody could see the lake level and flow records. The first sign we put up near the old boat ramp was carved from cedar by a local man named Chet. It said, "Red Bank Lake, protected by law, cared for by community." I liked that because it was true. By the summer of 2000, the lake had begun to feel like itself again. The water was clearer. The shoreline had stopped slipping near the north edge. Families came back. Kids skipped stones near the old boathouse. People who had avoided the lake because of fees and threats started bringing folding chairs down on Saturday mornings. You could hear laughter again. Real laughter, not the nervous kind people use when they are checking whether somebody important is listening. One evening, almost 2 years after Lydia first stepped out of that Lincoln and told me I owed her money, I was sitting on Uncle Earl's dock with Helen. The sun was dropping behind the trees, and the lake had that copper color it gets just before dark. Helen was holding a paper cup of coffee, and she said, "You know, most people would have sold this place after all that." I said, "Most people would have sold this place after all that." I said, "Most people are smarter than me." She laughed, and she got quiet and said, "No, Dan, most people are tired. There is a difference." I thought about that for a while. I thought about Uncle Earl sitting alone at this same lake, opening letters from Lydia, refusing to give in, probably wondering whether anyone would ever understand why he was fighting. I thought about the people who paid fees because they were tired, the ones who moved away, the ones who felt too old or too embarrassed to challenge someone who sounded official. Then I looked out at the water and said, I spent most of my life thinking peace meant nobody bothering you. But maybe peace is knowing you did not walk away when somebody tried to take what mattered. Helen nodded and said, "That sounds like something your uncle would have said." I told her not to start comparing me to him. I was still trying to avoid becoming a man who kept old newspapers from 1974. She smiled, and for a little while neither of us said anything. We just listened to the water touch the dock. Red Bank Lake is still there. The old valve is still there too, cleaned up now with a little plaque explaining how the Mercer family built the first flow system back in 1912. The Pine Ridge Shores office became a community resource room. The fake environmental charts came down. The fancy sign Lydia had placed near the entrance was removed, and nobody seemed to miss it. Sometimes people ask me whether I hate Lydia Voss. I do not. Hate takes too much room, and after everything that happened, I decided I wanted that room back. I do think she made the choice, though. She saw a community full of people who wanted to live quietly, and she mistook that for weakness. She saw an old man protecting a lake, and she mistook patience for surrender. She saw water and only saw money. That was her mistake. Because water remembers every hand that tries to control it, every pipe that pulls too hard, every lie told beside its shore. And sooner or later, the truth rises to the surface. So let me ask you something. If you had inherited a lake after people spent years trying to steal from it, would you have locked the gates and kept everyone out? Or would you have done what I did and given the community another chance? Was Lydia only a criminal? Or was she the kind of person a town creates when everybody stays quiet too long? Tell me what you think in the comments, because I have learned that the hardest fights are not always against strangers. Sometimes they are against the people standing right next door. And if stories about standing your ground, protecting what matters, and watching the truth catch up with people means something to you, subscribe and stay with me, because this was not the last time a quiet place in America had to fight back.